I was standing in my driveway holding a stack of papers that still didn't feel real in my hands. The afternoon was quiet, too quiet for what had just happened. Across the street, the woman who had spent months trying to control my life was sitting on her front steps, completely silent, staring at the ground like someone had just pulled the earth out from under her feet. 3 hours earlier, she had been threatening me with fines and serious consequences. Now, according to the documents I was holding, nearly half of her house legally belonged to me. And the worst part for her? This entire disaster started with a land survey she personally demanded. If you had told me a few months earlier that an HOA complaint would end like this, I would have laughed. Back then, I thought this was just another annoying neighborhood dispute. Something you endure, grumble about, and move on from. I had no idea she was about to chain together the exact series of events that would completely destroy her sense of power. When I moved into the house, I didn't expect trouble. The place wasn't flashy. It was an older home, built decades before the neighborhood decided it wanted to pretend it was upscale. I inherited it from a family member who had lived there quietly for most of their life. No drama, no HOA involvement, just a modest house on land that had been measured and recorded long before anyone thought about decorative mailboxes or approved paint colors. Over the years, the area around it had changed. New builds popped up, bigger houses, tighter property lines, a lot more concrete and a lot less common sense. Eventually, the homeowners association formed, and with it came rules that seemed less about maintaining standards and more about controlling people. I kept to myself, fixed what needed fixing, and assumed that as long as I wasn't bothering anyone, I wouldn't be bothered either. That assumption lasted until the first knock on my door. She didn't introduce herself like a neighbor. She introduced herself like an authority. Perfect posture, clipboard pressed against her chest, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She told me she was the HOA president and launched straight into violations before I even had a chance to respond. My mailbox wasn't regulation. My fence didn't match the approved aesthetic. Apparently, even the angle of my driveway was under review. I listened. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. That seemed to irritate her more than if I had. She kept glancing over my shoulder, like she was inspecting my house for additional problems while she talked. Before leaving, she handed me a warning notice and politely reminded me that non-compliance would result in fines. That was my first mistake. I thought that was the end of it. Over the next few weeks, the notices kept coming, each one more aggressive than the last. Language shifted from suggestions to demands, from reminders to threats. She never missed an opportunity to mention that the HOA had full authority and that fighting them would be very expensive. Every interaction followed the same pattern. She talked. I listened. She assumed silence meant submission. What she didn't know was that every notice she sent pushed me to start looking more closely at the paperwork. She clearly assumed I'd never read. I started with my own documents. Old ones. The kind that yellow at the edges and don't come with digital copies. Deeds, plats, surveys done so long ago they were drawn by hand and scanned decades later. I hadn't planned on finding anything unusual. I was just trying to understand exactly what the HOA could and couldn't legally enforce. One night, spread across my dining table, I noticed something that made me pause. The original survey had measurements that didn't quite match what newer HOA records showed. The discrepancy wasn't dramatic, but it was enough to make me uneasy. I grabbed a tape measure the next morning and checked a few reference points. Fence to corner marker, marker to driveway edge. That was when I felt it, that quiet, uncomfortable realization that something about the boundaries wasn't adding up. I didn't jump to conclusions. I didn't accuse anyone. I just kept measuring, slowly, carefully. Every time I checked, the numbers leaned in the same direction, toward her property. The HOA notices didn't stop. In fact, they escalated. Now she was copying other board members, mentioning compliance hearings, hinting that my lack of cooperation was being discussed. Still, I stayed calm. Outwardly, I looked like someone being pushed into a corner. In reality, I was gathering information. Then came the meeting notice. Mandatory HOA attendance. Topic: ongoing violations and enforcement actions. I already knew this was her stage. She wanted an audience. She wanted to make an example out of me. I went anyway. She ran the meeting like a courtroom drama where she was judge, jury, and star witness. She listed my violations in front of the room, shaking her head as if she was deeply disappointed in me as a person. When I finally spoke to ask for clarification on one particular property-related issue, she seized the opportunity. "That's exactly why we need a professional land survey," she said loudly. "To confirm boundaries once and for all." I remember the way she smiled when she said it, confident, certain, like she had already won. She suggested a survey would end all confusion and put responsibility squarely where it belonged. Then she added that the cost should be on me since I was the one raising questions. There was a vote. Predictable. Approved. As the meeting ended, she walked past me and quietly said, "This will settle things. You'll see." She was right. It did settle things. Just not the way she expected. By the time I left that room, the plan was already locked in. A full professional land survey. Not rushed. Not informal. One that followed every legal standard. One that would put exact numbers on paper that no amount of confidence or HOA authority could argue with. What she didn't understand was that paperwork doesn't care who you think you are. Measurements don't bend for titles, and land doesn't move just because someone powerful wants it to. She had demanded proof, and soon she was going to learn exactly what that proof said. The surveyor arrived on a clear morning a week later, right on time. White truck, company logo on the door. Orange vest folded neatly over the passenger seat. He stepped out carrying equipment that immediately made the situation feel more serious than any HOA complaint ever could. Tripods, metal detectors, measuring rods that looked like they belonged on a construction site, not in the middle of a suburban street. I walked out to greet him, signed the initial paperwork, and watched as he began setting up. Almost immediately, curtains shifted across the street. She noticed. Within minutes, her front door opened. She stepped outside pretending to check her phone, then slowly drifted toward her driveway, arms crossed, watching every move. No greeting this time, no clipboard, just observation. She was confident, relaxed. This survey was supposed to confirm what she already believed, that I was the problem. The surveyor explained the process in simple terms. He'd locate original markers, compare them against recorded plats, cross-reference newer documents, and then finalize the boundaries using legal standards. It would take most of the day. I didn't mention that I already suspected where this was going. As he worked, I stayed nearby but didn't interfere. Occasionally he asked questions, about fence placement, about when certain structures were built. I answered honestly. Every answer I gave seemed to make him pause, write something down, and double-check his instruments. By mid-morning, his tone had changed. He wasn't casual anymore. He was focused, careful, quiet in a way that told me something unexpected was forming. He asked if he could access my backyard. Then he asked if I had any objection to stepping briefly onto the neighboring property to verify measurements along the exterior edge of her house. That request alone caused a small knot to tighten in my chest. Surveys didn't usually involve standing next to someone else's foundation. I gave permission. He did his job, professionally, methodically. That's when she snapped. She marched across the street demanding to know why someone was measuring her house. The surveyor calmly explained that exterior measurements were required to confirm boundary alignment. He even showed her the authorization paperwork from the HOA meeting she herself had pushed for. She didn't like that she stood there, arms folded tighter now, jaw clenched, watching every step he took along the side of her home. When he placed a marker near the edge of her garage, she laughed. "You're wasting your time," she said. "That house has been there for years." He didn't respond. Lunchtime came and went. The equipment never moved. The lines on the ground grew more complex. Strings stretched between stakes. Numbers were scribbled, erased, recalculated. At one point, I watched the surveyor stop completely, stare at one of his readings, then slowly turn and look at her house. Not annoyed, not confused, concerned. He asked me to join him near the side yard. Quietly away from her, he explained that the original boundary markers placed decades ago didn't line up with where her house sat now. Not by inches, by feet, several feet, enough that it wasn't an error, enough that it couldn't be ignored. I asked him to repeat that. He did. Even more carefully this time. According to the legal boundary, a substantial portion of her structure crossed onto my property. Not a shed, not a fence, living space, load-bearing areas, structures that couldn't be moved without serious consequence. I didn't react right away. I just listened. He told me he still needed to finalize measurements and verify everything, But if the readings held, which they almost always did, this wasn't a dispute. It was encroachment. By late afternoon, he completed the final cross-checks, printed preliminary results, signed off on them with the kind of seriousness people reserve for things that will end up in court. He explained next steps. Official stamped survey, documentation delivered within days, legal confirmation suitable for title review and enforcement. Across the street, she was pacing. She approached again, no longer smiling. "What did you find?" she demanded. The surveyor didn't answer her directly. He told her, calmly, that the finalized results would be delivered officially, and that any questions about implications should be directed to a land use attorney. That word, attorney, hit her like a slap. She turned to me. "This is just procedure," she said, forcing a laugh. "Right? I didn't say anything." That silence finally broke her confidence. For the first time since I'd met her, she looked uncertain. 2 days later, the envelope arrived, official letterhead, stamped drawings, coordinates broken down into exact measurements. There it was in black and white. The boundary line wasn't where she believed it was. Her garage crossed it, one entire wall, part of the interior footprint. I read it 3 times just to be sure. I didn't rush over, I didn't celebrate. I made copies, scanned everything, and scheduled a consultation with a property attorney before saying a word. By the time she found out, I already knew my options. Encroachment law was blunt. Emotion didn't matter. HOA authority didn't matter. The structure existed on land it didn't own. The options were simple, even if the consequences weren't. She could negotiate. She could buy the land at market or above market value, or she could face legal action that might require removal, restructuring, or forced sale of the affected portion. When I finally showed her the documents, her hands shook as she flipped through the pages. She tried to argue, tried to poke holes, tried to claim the surveyor was incompetent. But numbers don't care about volume. The HOA board went silent when they received copies. Emails stopped, enforcement notices vanished. That full authority she loved to reference suddenly had limits. Very real limits. She stopped knocking on my door after that. Instead, she started asking questions she never thought she'd need answers to. About zoning, about property law, about settlements. And every single one of those questions existed for one reason only. The land survey she demanded had answered something she never meant to ask. Exactly where her power ended. By the time I sat down with the attorney, the situation had already shifted in ways she couldn't undo. I laid the survey out on his desk, watched him trace the boundary line with his finger, and waited. He didn't look surprised. He didn't hesitate. He simply nodded and said, "This is clean." That was when it fully sank in. This wasn't a gray area. This wasn't an HOA dispute. This was a property encroachment issue, and the law treated it very differently. Titles don't bend, surveys don't negotiate. And mistakes made years ago still carry consequences today. He explained it plainly. Her house had been built partially on land she didn't own. It didn't matter how long it had been there. It didn't matter that she was HOA president. It didn't even matter that permits had been approved at the time. What mattered was the boundary, and the boundary was wrong in her favor. She had 3 realistic options. Buy the land from me at a price we both agreed to. Go to court and risk a far worse outcome, or refuse entirely and force the issue, which legally put her in the weakest position possible. I didn't rush. I didn't threaten. I told my attorney to notify her formally and let the paperwork speak for itself. When she received that letter, things escalated fast. The confident emails stopped. The carefully worded HOA notices disappeared. In their place were frantic messages asking for meetings, asking for delays, asking for time to review options. For the first time since this started, she wasn't in control of the schedule anymore. The HOA board quietly removed her as point of contact for my property. Then, not so quietly, they asked their own legal counsel what kind of exposure they were facing for forcing a survey that uncovered a problem they'd ignored for years. Meetings that once felt like power plays turned into closed-door sessions. Neighbors noticed too. The same people who had avoided eye contact before were suddenly asking questions. Not gossip questions, careful ones. The kind people ask when they realize authority might have been built on something shaky. She tried one last tactic. She came to my door late one evening, no clipboard, no notes, just panic wrapped in politeness. She talked about compromises, about how we could move forward together. She even apologized, in the way people do when they're more afraid of consequences than regretful of behavior. I listened. Then I reminded her that none of this existed until she demanded proof. That she pushed for documentation, expert measurement, and official verification. That all I did was comply. She didn't argue after that she couldn't. The settlement came weeks later. Quiet, expensive. She bought the portion of land her house occupied at a price well above market value, plus covered legal costs. The HOA absorbed its own expenses and quietly revised several enforcement policies shortly afterward. She resigned as HOA president not long after that. Life in the neighborhood changed. Not dramatically, not loudly. Just enough that people felt it. Fewer notices, less policing. More common sense. The house I inherited didn't change at all, except for one thing. I finally understood why the paperwork mattered more than power. She wanted control. She wanted compliance. What she got instead was a lesson written in ink, sealed by measurements she insisted on. A reminder that real ownership isn't about who speaks the loudest or writes the most rules. It's about where the line actually is. And once that line was drawn, there was no crossing it again.